Well, we can speak now to former US presidential advisor Steve Gill. Lovely to see you again, Steve. Great news overnight about the 2 American hostages who've been released. And it does sort of give us all some hope that maybe things can be negotiated for the good.
Yeah, the part of the problem is that these hostages are being held by individual groups of the terrorists. So there's not a real clear indication of whether or not the Hamas leadership actually controls some of the individuals. And as you guys pointed out, the flow of some aid coming in from Egypt is good. It's a small, minuscule amount for 2 million people. And more importantly, Hamas is the government in Gaza. So we don't know that this aid actually gets into the hands of individual civilians, or whether it feeds the Hamas fighters first, fuels, no pun intended, their efforts before it actually helps the people.
Which is exactly the argument that Israel has been making, of course. But it has to be said, there's a huge amount of international pressure, and the idea of collective punishment, which is a term which is gaining momentum, actually. Do you think that is having an impact, and some pressure from President Biden as well, for Israel to at least pull back a little bit on what they were threatening?
Well, I'm not sure that President Biden is having much influence at all. And if the prime minister decides to follow President Biden's lead and have a conversation with the UK, I hope he follows the advice of President Biden and doesn't use his script. And I would say just don't say the same things that President Biden did, giving $100 million to the Gaza government, which is Hamas, and at the same time trying to shoehorn another $60 billion for Ukraine that has nothing to do with what's going on in Israel is the wrong track. And I think President Biden is getting a lot of pushback here in this country and not really having any influence in the Middle East. Again, it is a little bit of progress to get a few hostages released, but they're only doing that because of the military pressure that Israel is putting in the northern part. And I think that Israel is going to go in and try to extinguish the effect that Hamas has in Gaza.
But this does show the strength of diplomacy, does it not, though, that at least Qatar was able to intervene and help negotiate the release of those 2 hostages after President Biden had visited various people. I know he didn't get to meet some of the leaders that he wanted to, but also after Rishi Sunak. It proves the point, even to those cynical about it, that it does help to have some friends in the Middle East.
Yeah, and I think the attempt is very important. And again, we will see if this flow of some aid into Gaza will release some other hostages. There's still about 190 that are held. We don't know their conditions. There's not been proof of life. There's not been any real conversation of how they are being treated. I mean, so many babies, so many elderly that are not getting their medication, not getting cared for. And if there isn't the flow of food or medication into Gaza, you can bet that the hostages are not getting any piece of it at this point. If the Hamas leadership is serious about trying to divert to diplomacy rather than military action, they will release a lot more than 2 hostages.
Yeah. What do you make of what President Biden said about not following the example of America when it came to 9/11? Was that, I mean, there are lots of ways you could look at that, but is some of that to do with the exit strategy, which obviously didn't happen with the retribution that America and the West tried to play on bin Laden? The fact there doesn't seem to be sort of an exit strategy or a long-term strategy in what Israel's planning here?
Well, I think nobody thinks that Israel should long-term try to occupy Gaza. They did give Gaza a free rein to govern themselves, and they elected Hamas. They put the terrorists in charge by a vote, contrary to what President Biden said the other day. And I think the problem with his speech, and granted, it was much better than his flight home and his impromptu press conference on Air Force One, when his approach to the missile strike from the terrorists that hit a parking lot next to the hospital to tell them that they need to learn to shoot better, shoot straighter, was a disaster. And I don't think his speech did much better when he focused more on Islamophobia, focused more on Ukraine than he did the situation in Israel. So I think President Biden has not helped the situation directly. I think Prime Minister Sunak did a much better job, and hopefully his leadership in this debate will have a lot more impact.
That's very interesting that actually you think President Biden hasn't really been that much of a help. He did speak out about trying to keep a lid on getting too angry, on letting things get too emotional in their response. He did a pretty good job, didn't he? But you don't think so?
No, and again, keep in mind that the emotions that we're seeing when you have a misinformation campaign, when a Hamas or affiliate rocket hits a parking lot, kills 50, not 500 or 700. The inflamed Middle East through that misinformation is where we've seen the real emotions that are out of control. And I think trying to ratchet that back when we have members of Congress in the United States who are continuing to spread the lie that Israel targeted a hospital, that's what's making it more difficult, not the efforts of Israel to warn people, to get people out of harm's way in northern Gaza before they start their military operations. Keep in mind, nobody's really reporting that hundreds and if not thousands of rockets are pouring into civilian areas of Israel every day from Hamas and sometimes from Hezbollah as well. That targeting of civilians is ignored by most of the media.
Well, I wouldn't say it's ignored, Steve, but I guess the difference is Iron Dome, which is that incredible system that Israel has, which targets and brings down very nearly all of those rocket attacks. So they're having a less of an impact, at least.
Yeah, I think, and again, but for the Iron Dome, we would be seeing civilian casualties in Israel mounting. It's just the Iron Dome that's preventing them. And that's why some of these resources need to be heading to Israel to make sure that they've got the Iron Dome facilities needed to continue to shoot those down. But again, President Biden's focus was more on Ukraine, putting $60 billion more in Ukraine. And even when he was defending the $100 million that's going to Gaza, he was saying, well, we're going to make sure that it actually gets to the people. There's no guarantee that can happen. And is it going to be better monitored than the $130 billion that the U.S. has already put into Ukraine, where there's no receipts, there's no accountability, there's no transparency? I don't believe that the money going into Gaza will be better handled than what we see that's gone into Ukraine, particularly when you see some of the weapons that are being brandished by the Hamas terrorists that looks very familiar to U.S. weapons, M4 rifles that were either left behind in Afghanistan or have been transmitted from the sale in Ukraine into the hands of these same terrorists. I think there's a lot more to be investigated before we follow the lead of President Biden.
It was an interesting part of his speech as well, his speech from the Oval Office, when he said to the American people, I know you probably feel it's a world away. Both these wars are a world away, but it's important that we care. What is the state of feeling of the ordinary American people?
I think people do care. And again, when they see the carnage, whether it's, babies and individuals being hurt in Gaza or what we saw with these atrocities that were targeted at individuals in Israel, I think people are outraged. And I think their hearts are broken over what we've seen on both sides. I think the challenge is to remind people that the atrocities that happened on October 7th were targeted at civilians. And anytime you get into a conflict, as we've seen in the past in the Middle East, civilians will be injured when you have a war. We've seen it in Ukraine. We've seen it in every other conflict. But reminding people that the collateral damage is a distinct difference than the intentional atrocities that we saw in Israel, and that those atrocities will continue until Hamas is ripped out at the roots. But I think there is humanitarian concern for the carnage and the damage and the deaths and casualties on both sides.